into a concluding section. I really don't know how much time I have because I can't actually see the chat. And I'm using
You have about a minute remaining.
Okay, great. So we'll jump very quickly. Thank you. So very quickly, American consciousness and consciousness toward the enslaved or the prison slave. We could check very quickly some historical sites, and we learned that there are different ideas around that are pro-slavery and that were anti-slavery. Pro-slavery, devastating the economy, that people would go wild, that it was natural, right? And that was in the late 1880s, right? Yet things like this happened, right? And things like this are happening right now today, right? And if we think about now or currently, we can also think about this in terms of our consciousness and our conscience toward the prison slave, right now and currently. Some of the same kind of language is used. If you free the prisoners, they would go wild. Some people deserve to be locked away. And we really want to drop into a more abolitionist conscience and consciousness when it comes to our kinfolk, right? Building alternative economic relations that we need. Black people distinctly and specifically, like we know how to combat racialized systems of power and oppression. We don't need jails and prisons to be well. They don't make us well. Black communities deserve to heal from historical trauma together and on our own terms, unimpeded by white supremacy and its onlookers, including the state and maybe even white people, right? When I say Black Lives Matter, I mean all Black Lives Matter. And that moves me to a more full abolitionist praxis as well. I think about this paper from the Black Southern tradition. I think about this paper as kind of one Sunday on the way to that great getting up morning, right? So thank you for allowing that. And with that, I will shut up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Brooks.
Thank you. Let me see. Okay, sure. Okay, everyone can see the presentation? Am I on? Okay, sorry. So this presentation is based on chapter 2 of my dissertation, which is a case study of the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago and how the Black Panthers inspired community organizing approaches in not just Black neighborhoods, but in Puerto Rican and poor white neighborhoods. And today I'm mainly going to focus on the phenomenological method that I use in the dissertation, which I argue best captures the approach to solidarity that the Panthers practice, excuse me, in Chicago. And although I am interested in the other well-known analyses and procedures and praxis of the Rainbow Coalition's political organizing efforts, whether they be called democratic socialists, Marxists, or whatever. But given that there's already been a lot of work published on like the, that traditional political theory of the Black Panthers, I'm interested in exploring the phenomenological meanings surrounding race among the Panthers and the members of the coalition. And I argue that these meanings of race and identity were not reduced to any one particular identity, such as class or nation, although self-determination was a commonality in for all members in the Rainbow Coalition. So I begin by asking, what are the conditions of possibility for interracial solidarity? And as I said, my case study is the Black Panthers Rainbow Coalition in 1969. And so in the paper, I look at both phenomenological and non-phenomenological approaches to analyzing race and identity in the United States. And because I talk about solidarity, I'm going to briefly define that term, and I'll go into it in a bit more detail later. But I basically define it as political action on other people's terms. And I use this definition along with others by Juliet Hooker, who calls solidarity seen through the eyes of the other. And for another phenomenological, what I would argue is a phenomenological interpretation of race and identity, is Lonnie Guinier and Torres' idea of political race that they talk about in The Miner's Canary. And then I'll wrap things up in the conclusion. Okay. Okay. So briefly, the Black Panther Party's chapter in Chicago has gotten a lot of attention recently, especially with the movie Judas and the Black Messiah. I don't know if how many of you have seen it, but it's pretty good. But anyway, I just wanted to quickly go over the background of the case that I analyzed. So the Illinois chapter of the Panthers was established in '68 in Oakland, California. I mean, they were chartered and approved by the national chapter in Oakland by Bobby Rush and Fred Hampton were the two of the main leaders of that organization. And they fought against, in Chicago, Mayor Daley's urban renewal efforts and gentrification projects, which was aligned with his desire to clean up Chicago and make it more friendly to middle-class people and business leaders. And so they were fighting against that, in addition to the police brutality that they experienced as well. And so I argue that solidarity was an essential component of the Panthers' political action, not just in the United States, but also abroad. There's a lot of literature on that as well. And as Harold Bloom and Waldo Martin Jr. detail in Black Against Empire, there was any member of the Chicago Panthers, and as in most chapters around the country, had to read and discuss a selection of radical texts, including the works by Frantz Fanon, Huey Newton, Mao Zedong, Malcolm X, and Karl Marx. And it was an education program to ensure that there was a solidarity and within the Panthers organization. And Fred Hampton is obviously one of the most well-known member of the Chicago Panthers. And in this speech, he said, we say you don't fight racism with racism, you're going to fight racism with solidarity. We say you don't fight capitalism with no Black capitalism, you fight capitalism with socialism. And so solidarity was one of the key components of the Panthers' political and organizational agendas. But another person that who really did a lot of the political organizing work, the day-to-day work, was Bob Lee, who was the chief, or like one of the top field organizers, who moved up to Chicago in the '60s from Texas. And he went to a meeting in the Uptown neighborhood of Chicago, and he kind of incidentally met members of the group, the Young Patriots, and got to see the commonalities and tried to get them to see the commonalities that they shared with the Panthers and the Puerto Ricans. And so he said in a speech before, or in like an organizing pitch before some community members in Uptown, that the Panthers are here for Uptown, for anyone who lives in Uptown. We come here with our hearts open, and you cats to supervise us where we can be of help to you. And he said the Young Patriots have the same color of skin, though. Now we're going to have to deal with the concept of poverty, man. And he said the same thing is happening on the South Side and the West Side. And if you can realize that concept of poverty, a revolution can begin. So, and that's a picture at the United Conference Against Fascism. But to talk about phenomenology of race, I'm working within the phenomenological tradition of Alfred Schutz. in his text, The Phenomenology of the Social World. And he really emphasizes the importance of intersubjectivity and the importance of meaning context. And a couple of contemporary phenomenologists who are working within the same tradition as well are Linda Martine Alcoff and Lewis Gordon, but W.E. Du Bois' explication of Black Americans' double consciousness is also, I would argue, a phenomenological meditation on race and identity. Basically, the phenomenological argument of identity is that identities are created in an intersubjective context. As Linda Martine Alcoff argues, identities are not permanently fixed, but they are sites or horizons of positions, quote, from which one must engage in the process of meaning making, and thus from which one is open to the world. And so in terms of race, identity, and solidarity, while interracial organizations are possible, and that's what the Rainbow Coalition symbolizes, potential members need to approach and learn from one another with epistemic humility. One's identity from a phenomenological perspective does not predetermine one's political, economic, or social position indefinitely, nor does it reify one's relationship with others in the social world. A phenomenological account of race and solidarity then does not presuppose uniform or homogeneous accounts of individual or group identity. And now some other, what I call just non-phenomenological accounts of race and identity in the United States are ones that analyze and focus on the legal, political, and social function of race in the United States, but do not always interrogate the presuppositions of what constitutes racial meaning beyond prescribed roles. And one of the authors I look at in the paper, or three authors I look at in the paper, Tommy Shelby, Cheryl Harris, and David Rudiger. And Tommy Shelby's book, We Who Are Dark, he argues that race-based solidarity is not inimical or threatening to liberal democracy. And as long as it remains what he calls pragmatic, which I interpret as being able to work with others who identify as belonging to different races and identities. And although he does not rule out the possibility of interracial or other group-based solidarity, his focus is an ethical defense of Black racial solidarity, and not about the transformative potential of individual and group identity that could result from a politics of solidarity. And in Cheryl Harris's work on the whiteness as property, she illustrates a juridical operation of race in the United States, and how and when de jure race-based exclusion of non-whites was dismantled through legislative and judicial rulings. But she argues that this did not get rid of the racial hierarchies and the absence of de jure racial discrimination. And even though this is not a phenomenological analysis, it is still a vital contribution in augmenting a critical understanding of the function of race, and that Cheryl Harris eviscerates the logic of colorblindness in terms of its effectiveness in ameliorating racism and racist institutions. In David Rudiger's book, The Wages of Whiteness, he looks at the psychological and social and political development of the white worker in comparison to the Black worker, which is heavily indebted to W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. And he looks at the threat of bondage as significant and signifying to whites without material wealth, that there was a possibility that their socioeconomic and political position could be compromised. And so when I'm illustrating and comparing these different approaches to analyzing race, in the United States is that although non-phenomenological accounts offered by Harris, Rudiger, and Tommy Shelby offer meaningful analyses of race and identity at particular points in time, I argue in the case of the Panthers that a phenomenological analysis captures a greater degree of lived experience of race. And emphasizing the lived experience of race is valuable because it allows one to critically reflect and view on the power dynamics of racialized societies. And phenomenological engagement and analysis of race requires that we interrogate and problematize the presuppositions of the experience of racial embodiment and identity. And briefly, solidarity, which is what I'm focusing on with the Panthers, is, as Juliet Hooker writes, it means being able to see through the eyes of the other. It's to kind of transition from it's a transition from purely empathetic understanding to political action. And so Avery Collars, in his book A Moral Theory of Solidarities, argues that it is, quote, a perfect duty. Through solidarity, we atone for standing by or benefiting while others were treated unjustly. And just as a simple example, he says, if you want to practice solidarity, or if you want to live up to that duty of solidarity, just don't cross a picket line, regardless of whether you agree or not. It's your duty to not cross it. It's not your duty to question the tactic of picketing, or the tactic of shouting or striking for a particular purpose. Your duty is to support those who are oppressed. And Lewis Gordon, I think, makes a good connection to solidarity, in that he says that we need to act with political commitment. And while goals of solidarity have concrete goals, such as an organized political movement for fair housing or voting rights or opposition to the death penalty, risk is also inherent to the solidarity action. And Lewis Gordon writes, quote, political commitment requires acting without knowing the outcome, acting for those whom one will ultimately never know. No political act offers guarantees save one. It will affect others whom one would ultimately never know. And although acts of solidarity begin when people organize and unite and call for change by placing demands on actors who are invested in the status quo of the political system, these acts are not intended to just benefit individuals who are living now, but they are intended to benefit those who are going to be here when we are not.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. And so this is a picture of the announcing of the Rainbow Coalition. I argue that it's solidarity in action. I can talk about political race and question and answer if there's time. And in conclusion, racial identity is not a closed ontology. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Lester Spence.
What I'm going to do with about 45 seconds first is hold a moment of silence. This is about a year to the day where everything pretty much stopped. As I've said on a few other panels and things I've been involved in this week, I lost 15 to 16 people due to COVID, all of them Black, all of them from Detroit. And I know that we've all suffered a great deal of loss, even at the same time as we've created kind of a way out of no way. In a way, if we think about us being involved or being in community here, that kind of represents an example of that. So I'm going to take about 30 seconds first. All right. All right. So now, yeah. So these things work. I'm just saying. So, I know we've got I know we got like chairs. These things actually work. I got 10 minutes on mine. I'm taking 10. I'm taking straight up 10. So what I'm gonna do is I'm only gonna read a portion of my paper, but my paper represents an attempt to wrestle with the Afro-pessimist turn, not just in the humanities, but also in the social sciences. And what I wanna do is just go at one specific element. The 4 challenges with Afro-pessimism as it stands is it misses Black heterogeneity, it misses change over time, it doesn't acknowledge Black agency, and it misreads the work in a number of instances. What I'm gonna do is take the concept of social death articulated by Orlando Patterson in his work examining slave systems and argue that the Afro-pessimists misread that. And then what I'm gonna do is talk about what I think is a more productive way to think about slavery and its results. That result or that dynamic is provided by W.E.B. Du Bois. Earl's here. Shout out to Earl Henderson. I think for helping me with this reading, although it's possible I came up with it before that. So I'm gonna go to read Orlando Patterson's work on social death. Patterson's work, which seeks to provide a detailed comparative analysis of slavery, distinguishes the slave from the non-slave in a few specific ways. The slave is distinguished from the non-slave. You know what, let me stop just for a second. The reason I'm making this distinction for those of you who aren't familiar with the Afro-pessimist literature is the Afro-pessimist literature is based on the notion that there is no fundamental distinction between the slave and the person that comes after that. So Black people now represent our slaves, whether it's on the micro level. Frank Wilderson, who's married to a white woman, actually suggests that he is his wife's slave at the meso level and at the macro level. And in making that argument that the Black now is a slave, they turn to Orlando Patterson's notion of social death. So I'm gonna go back to this. Patterson's work, which seeks to provide a detailed comparative analysis of slavery, distinguishes the slave from the non-slave in a few specific ways. The slave is distinguished from the non-slave in that she has about as little power as it's possible to have, and the coercion the slave undergoes is almost total. Force in its rawest form is the basis of slavery, the basis of the slave-master relationship. Unlike the wage laborer, who the Afro-pessimists make a strong critique against Marxist readings in order to make a juxtaposition between the slave and the Marxist laborer. Unlike the wage laborer, who even under the poorest of circumstances takes a wage in exchange for labor, and then after that exchange is no longer under the remit of the person paying the wage, the slave usually receives no such wage, or at the very least, if she does, she remains a slave. The second constitutive element of slavery is the natal alienation that occurs. The slave is born to no one, leaves no progeny, has no family to speak of, no community to speak of, and has no legitimate independent connection to any group formally recognized by the state. Because the slave is metaphorically born to no one and metaphorically leaves no progeny, there are no explicit intergenerational ties. Relatedly, this status is inheritable. The children born by the slave shared one thing, if no other thing, the status as a slave. Finally, the third constitutive element of slavery is its nature as a dishonoring system. Slaves were dishonored beings if for no other reason than the fact that the only power the slave had came through another. These three constitutive components lead to what Patterson calls social death, by dint of the fact that as a result of these three components, the slave is for all intents and purposes a non-being. And as a result of that death, was either viewed as the product of a hostile alien culture or as the defeated enemy. As there are not that many large-scale slave societies that routinely base their enslavement on one of these processes, Patterson suggests that most slave societies base slavery on that first notion rather than the second notion. In as much as the socially dead had to somehow relate to the socially live, the master serves as the mediator. Both of these ideas serve Afro-pessimism. For Wilderson, it is clear that the slave as such is not the wage laborer, and any attempt to bring together different sets of workers against capital is going to have to reckon with the stark differences between the wage laborer and the slave. The wage laborer collects a wage and wants to collect his full wage. Wants, in other words, for the gap between the wage he accepts and the wage from which the capitalist garners a profit to be reduced to zero. The slave, who unlike the wage laborer is socially dead, has no wage to speak of and no legitimate community from which to have the rights recognized in the first place. Work is not an organic principle for the slave. This is Patterson. For Patterson, the act of freeing a slave, manumission, created what Patterson called an inalienability problem, a problem with three components: conceptual, cultural, and social. Conceptually speaking, because the slave doesn't own anything and is instead owned by the master, the slave cannot purchase freedom. The slave cannot somehow earn money and then use this money to purchase her freedom, because she'd basically be using the master's own resources to purchase said freedom. Further, no third party can do it either, because that third party is either using funds provided by the slave, which gets us back to the original problem, or the third party is using funds provided by either that person, him or her, their self, or some other party, which in effect transfers the slave from the original master to a new one. How do we reconcile this culturally speaking? Here, Patterson turns to the anthropological research on gift exchanges, which involve both a utilitarian element and an ideological element, which works to rationalize various aspects of the exchange itself, reconciling things like the idea that a gift is somehow freely given without obligation, and the system resulting from such exchanges, which is called prestation. Manumission, Patterson argues, is a form of prestation, or a sophisticated system of gift exchanges. Now, I don't actually need to read much of the rest of this. What I'll do is move to the Afro-pessimist position, in part because of that dynamic, because the slave can't necessarily, because of all these problems resulted with the gift exchange, the slave cannot necessarily be freed by slavery. But here's the thing: if you read Patterson's account of manumission, when he's talking about how manumission appears in the United States, he only focuses on one dynamic, and that's a dynamic in which the slave is actually given freedom by the master. And relatedly, talks about a dynamic in which the slave purchases freedom from the master, right? And then he goes on to note that the US South is one of the most notorious slave systems amongst all he analyzes, because manumission rates were incredibly low. So how do we explain that Afro-pessimist position if manumission rates were incredibly low? I actually argue that they misunderstand the nature of that post-Civil War dynamic. That is, they articulate emancipation as a form of manumission, or Patterson himself does not acknowledge manumission as emancipation. Now, how are we to think about emancipation in a more productive way? So here, Du Bois's work on the Civil War becomes incredibly important. Du Bois is attempting to do a couple of different things with Black Reconstruction. One is go against the idea that slavery was some type of beneficial dynamic to help modernize Black folk. Two is he's trying to make a more sophisticated argument about the role of class, race, and labor than that provided by Marx. What he argues is the Black slave, him, her, their self, actually created the conditions for their own emancipation. So it wasn't that Black slaves were freed, Black folk created the conditions by which they freed themselves. So what I'm gonna do is I've got, by my own reckoning, like 5 minutes, like 3 to 5 minutes to talk about this stuff. Yeah, I don't need that. What I'll end with is that. So this project is something I'm calling kind of Afro-realism. That term sucked. I'm looking for a better one. But what I really want us to do, like I said, these things work. What I really want us to do is think about that dynamic and think about even the simple act of reading and misreading a text. I would argue that the Afro-pessimists, by misreading that text, misread the nature of Black life in the 20th and the 21st century, both here in the United States and abroad. Now I know them out.
All right. Thank you so much for those very interesting and dynamic presentations. I'm just going to offer some very brief remarks and give the panelists an opportunity to respond to some of the queries I posed, and then we will open it up for questions more broadly. So just to read across the papers, they were in conversation because each of the presentations in their own way contended with both the entanglements and antagonisms of political, juridical, phenomenological, and ontological renderings of race, racism, and Blackness. And relatedly, the ways in which the collision of freedom and unfreedom are most manifest in what has historically been called the Negro problem, and attempts to grapple with this issue by the state and by Black folks themselves. And so there's an issue of solidarity, there's an issue of how one reads or misreads the condition of Blackness, and then how one reads law and legality and the ways in which that might preserve or offer up freedom. The reading against each presentation in their own way read against codified notions of race and Blackness, whether it's a challenge to the 13th Amendment, a challenge to non-phenomenological notions of Blackness, or the challenge to Afro-pessimism and the ways in which Afro-pessimism has circulated within Black studies and Black study more broadly. And then each paper also, one explicitly and others implicitly, grapple with this notion of solidarity. What are the possibilities of solidarity in a settler colonial, fundamentally anti-Black society? And what are the ways in which solidarity is evaded or undermined by the ways in which we engage with or understand different types of texts, whether they be legal, philosophical, or Black studies texts themselves. So I had a number of questions for Tommy, or a number of provocations. First of which, I wonder what the legal and material difference between slavery and involuntary servitude are. I feel like I have yet to hear a distinction made between these two when persons are interrogating the 13th Amendment, and does the sort of carceral state that unfolds in the post-emancipation moment, does it emanate from slavery or involuntary servitude, or both? Another question is, I wanted you, Tommy, to tarry more with duly, right? The notion of duly as opposed to justly or fairly. Does duly objectively mean justly or fairly? Because the denotation of that term is in accordance with what is required or appropriate, following proper procedure or arrangement. So there's a way in which following the procedural doesn't necessarily equate with a fair or just outcome. And I wonder if that use of duly in the 13th Amendment allows for these sort of evasions of justice and fairness that you outline in the cases that you offer. Throughout the presentation, there's a sort of conflation of criminalization and enslavement that makes it seem as if criminality was the primary sort of either legitimating architecture or material reality that created the conditions for racial slavery, which seems to me to be a bit ahistorical. And I wonder, are enslavement and criminality conjunctural, or are they synonymous? And if you can speak to that a little bit more. And by the way, you can address all or none of this. These are just some things that came up. And another thing I was thinking about was how does one account for the contextually and historically specific aspects of carcerality? For example, the rise of the prison industrial complex in the late 1970s in the context of Black Power uprisings, and the ways in which carcerality had as much to do with containing this radical and counter-hegemonic cadre of Black and racialized folks as it did with as it did with sort of having a regime of labor, so to speak, a free regime of labor. And what might the rise of the prison industrial complex in the 1970s have to do with the 13th Amendment? So to state that a little bit differently, is there a way that tracing all of carcerality back to the 13th Amendment might miss or obscure or obfuscate contextual and historical dynamics that are also linked to carcerality? And also, and then I guess I'll just end with, what are the scholars and literatures that you're writing against? So what is, I guess, broadly, what is the intervention that you're making? For Brooks, I was so glad that your presentation spoke more about the actual Black Panther Party of Chicago, because when reading the paper, it was the framework through which you were going to read them, but that reading wasn't as present as it was in your presentation. But I still wonder, what does the phenomenological account of race reveal that a Black Marxist or a critical race theoretical perspective does not? Because you make this claim that this offers up something unique or useful, and I wasn't quite certain what that was. And so I wonder if you can speak more to that. And then I wonder if you can actually give an example of a reading of an example of the Black Panthers, a phenomenological reading of one iteration of something the Black Panthers did. So let me ask it this way. Can you just sort of, is there something like a program or an action that the Chicago Panthers Party did that is best illuminated by a phenomenological reading as opposed to another reading? Like, so can you give a concrete example of that? And then in your paper, you talked about the political left and the ways in which the political left can sort of offer they can say, they claim that because race is not biological, that then race doesn't matter. That's not a left that's familiar to me. And I wonder if how thinking with Black left scholars, Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther V. Cooper Jackson, Emil Karkabal, Walter Rodney, et cetera, how thinking with those Black Marxist, socialist, communist scholars, and the ways in which they're engaging oppression and super exploitation might still offer up a way of thinking about race and the necessity of solidarity that doesn't discount race at all, if that makes sense. And then in terms of your paper, Lester, I was thinking about this notion of misreading and how the misreading of Patterson is different from, or might be linked to, this idea of reading against the grain, which is another sort of methodological approach. And so could it be argued that the Afro-pessimists are reading against the grain, or are they in fact misreading? And what is this intentional, right? And what is at stake in a misreading versus a reading against the grain of Patterson? So thinking with Patterson as opposed to using his intervention as taking his intervention literally, right? I don't know if that's a clear question. And then can you speak more about why the conflating or elision of manumissions and emancipation is so problematic, and what it is that conflation distorts, and how it is that a Du Boisian reading disentangles those two, or offers a productive account of the post-emancipation Blackness, so to speak. And then I guess you talked in your paper about this magical moment of 1865 and the ways that the Afro-pessimists they read against this magical moment of 1865 because they're arguing that there was no real emancipation moment, right? And then so you say that Du Bois, he sort of, by focusing on the ways in which Black people emancipated themselves, he does offer up 1865 as a significant moment. But I wonder if Du Bois upends this sort of magical thinking altogether, this magical moment thinking altogether, or no, that's not the question, sorry. Never mind. Let me not ask this question because I don't even know what I'm talking about. So I'll just leave it there. I've taken up enough time, but I do want to give the panelists time to respond, and then we can open it up with the remaining time. Anybody? Or do you want to take questions from the audience?
Could we take questions and then maybe fold our responses into the questions?
Sure. So remember, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. So we do have one from Dr. Errol Henderson, and his question is for Tommy. To what extent does the 14th Amendment granting of citizenship to Black persons make moot the 13th Amendment qualification regarding slavery? That is, if all incarcerated persons are citizens by the 14th Amendment, then they cannot be chattel. For example, even death row inmates who are pregnant do not have their child put on death row, as chattel slavery transfers chattel status to the child of slaves. The 14th Amendment's grant of citizenship seems to prevent any citizens from being chattel. What do you think of that argument? Are there other questions? Oh, go ahead, Tommy.
I'm sorry. Am I answering this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. There's no other questions right now, so you can answer anything that's been thrown out there.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll start with that question there. Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and I think, or like, what the thing that comes up for me is around how I'm not saying, or like, yeah, I'm not saying that Black people are, even when in prison, I'm not saying Black people are chattel slaves, right? I'm saying that Black people, when incarcerated, are prison slaves, and that when not incarcerated, are prison slaves in waiting. And to me, that's like, or like very different from what you're saying. And maybe I'm not understanding your question. But yeah, I guess I can't and don't get to the rest of it because I'm not trying to make that like that equation, if that makes sense.
Is there so what is the relationship between citizenship and being a slave in waiting? Does being a slave in waiting abrogate citizenship? Does it attenuate it? Is there any relationship there? Just to piggyback on what Dr. Henderson is asking.
Sure. I mean, I guess one could say Black citizenship, or like, which is the qualifier, right? Black citizenship is that of the prison slave in waiting, right? It yeah, or like from my end or from my side, I don't think I feel like pressed to say more about that than that. Yeah. But I'll definitely, or citizenship. Yeah, I'll definitely like think more about it for sure. But those are the immediate things that are coming up around it.
Thank you. Brooks or Lester, do you want to hop in? Oh, before I go on to reading the question from Athena King.
Oh, real quick, could you do me a favor? Sharice, I got the first question. Although I don't, to be weird, well, to be honest, I don't quite get it, but I know what the question is. The second question, could you put that in the chat? Like, if you got it, do you have it typed out, or are you just
are you talking about the Elijah of manumission and emancipation?
Yeah.
I just asked, why is it problematic? Because you made it sort of a to-do about that.
I don't need that. I'll take a crack. I'll take a crack at the second. The first, I would love to have Jasmine talked about it in the chat. I would love to actually have you. So when you're saying reading against the grain, I actually I literally don't know what that means. Does that mean that that they're only taking a portion of it and then are on purpose not taking the rest, or are they purposely taking the concept and then just not applying it in the way the author intended on purpose? Like, what does that reading against the grain, what does that mean?
I think it means reading against commonly held beliefs. So for example, you might take the Declaration of Independence and read it in a way that you're looking for. So we laud it as, for example, people laud it as like this emancipatory, this sort of this revolutionary document. But then Gerald Horne, for example, can read it as a counter-revolutionary document. So he's reading against all of the mythology and commonly held beliefs, the same document, to pull out different forms of meaning. And it's I think largely a feminist. It's linked to a feminist way of reading, to look for sort of silences, elisions, and erasures in the archive. So bringing out other. Go ahead.
So I think what they're doing is they're reading against the grain of that moment. That is what they're doing. But in reading against the grain of that moment, they're reading Patterson. They're not reading against Patterson. They're reading against the grain in which, that 1865 moment. They're trying to read Patterson straight. So when I take them as reading Patterson straight, then I think that gives me an opportunity to say, okay, how are you reading Patterson? If you're reading Patterson straight, then what are you getting right or wrong about Patterson? So taking that 1865 moment as a serious rupture, the stakes are simple. Are Blacks slaves, no matter what their status is, after that moment? That is freedom totally illusory, right? Relatedly, is the slave up until the moment they write about it totally unthought as a being, or is that moment not illusory? And then the role of Black people in that moment themselves, there's a connection there, as opposed to their attempt to make that moment that moment, right? So the important thing. There are a few things that are important to me about the 1865 thing, but the one thing I don't think I talked about in my presentation is that they did not intend that Civil War to be about slavery. In fact, the original, Tommy's paper was on the 13th Amendment. The original 13th Amendment was the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment would have made it unconstitutional for any amendment to mess with states' domestic stuff, up to and including slavery. And that amendment itself would have been unamendable. The Civil War wasn't about slavery until Black folk made it about slavery. So by taking that moment and suggesting it wasn't magical, and then taking that moment and suggesting that what comes after was different, it allows for development, it allows for agency. And then the Black heterogeneity thing isn't something I was able to get to in that paper. But I would actually argue to a certain extent it allows for Black heterogeneity.
Brooks, do you want to hop in here to address anything? Because the next two questions are for the other panelists.
Yeah, quickly, in my paper, I wasn't trying to, but thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Burden-Stelly, about how it may appear that I'm arguing that a phenomenological method of race is somehow radically different than what a Black Marxist or critical race theorist offers. I'm not arguing that. I would actually think that you could look at some Black Marxist writers or critical race theorists that even though they may not call themselves what they're doing phenomenological analysis, but I would argue that that's what they're doing. In the paper I point to Du Bois as who was writing at the time where this kind of method of phenomenology was being debated in Germany, and I argue that he is a phenomenological like, analysts of race, because race is not a closed, social identity or social ontology. And so I think, thanks for bringing that up, because I know I should probably address that. Like, I'm not saying that phenomenology is different than what Black Marxists or what critical race theorists do. And in terms of an example of what the Panthers did that was phenomenological, what I'm going to do in the dissertation is look at speeches of Hampton and Bob Lee, in which they are saying, like, you're not joining the Panthers as just a proletarian, like you're joining the Panthers as an accomplice, so to speak, as a hillbilly, like you're as a white hillbilly, like you're joining us. Like you're not like erasing that white hillbilly identity as part of this rainbow coalition. Like you're white, I'm Black, the Puerto Ricans are brown. Like we're like challenging the political machine together, but we're doing it in a way that does not like simply reduce our identities to class. Like, so it's not, so they're not racially, they were not doing, their idea of race was not racially eliminative, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to read the two comments from the two questions from Dr. Athena King, and then these can be addressed by the respective panelists. So for Tommy, they ask, I've always wondered, when people discuss the 13th Amendment, are they talking about slavery per se, or are they talking about peonage? When arrested, tried, incarcerated people cannot meet a financial obligation like bail, paying for a lawyer, et cetera, it appears that they're being subjected to peonage. So the 13th Amendment appears to note the criminalization of Blackness exists fully, as noted by the disproportionality of Black arrest incarceration, but the notion of slavery per se seems unclear. And then the next question is for Brooks. Why study the Panthers compared to another group that embraces racial solidarity with a political focus? Would groups like the SCLC, SNCC, CBC, or even the NOI encapsulate the phenomenology of race also? Or do you think that the Black Panther Party is better in terms of, it better embodies racial solidarity? So Brooks or Tommy, do you want to approach that?
Tommy, you can go if you want.
I feel like I'm going to take some time to think more on those questions, actually. Definitely appreciate them, for sure. But I think I do want to say that, like, Dr. Spence, I'm coming back to what you said about the Corin Amendment, and my understanding of the Corin Amendment is that it's all about slavery. It was all about protecting the state's right for that institution. So for me, the Corin Amendment or the 13th Amendment, both were very much about chattel enslavement. And maybe I misheard you. I'm not sure.
Or maybe you meant the abolition of slavery?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So what I meant,
sorry.
thank you for that. What I meant was that the North had slave states, and the North was incredibly willing to actually have the South. Lincoln was more concerned with a unified nation, even to the point where he was willing to modify the nature of the Constitution. Like, the Constitution was supposed to be this incredibly dynamic document, which made it unique from other similar situated states. He was willing to do that in order to keep the South from seceding. When the Civil War began, when the Civil War began, that anytime the North, the Union Army encountered Black slaves or encountered slaves, they were tasked to give those slaves back to their masters. It was only when Blacks took it upon themselves to make the war about slavery. That then Lincoln responded, and then the Civil War, the nature of the Civil War changed. That's what I'm suggesting.
Word, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Okay, Brooks, if you want to address the last question, you'll have the last word. We're coming right up on 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Eastern.
Okay, thank you, Dr. King, for that question. The main reason why I started on the project with the Panthers was I was intrigued and just fascinated by the Rainbow Coalition, the fact that that in the 1960s the Black Panthers could get Southern white hillbillies to say they support Black power. And if they could do that in the 1960s, like, why is it so radical or crazy for white people to work on and be accomplices with Black Lives Matter? So it was mainly just like something that I just started pondering, and then just a few years later, here I am. So thank you.
All right, with that, we are going to close out this panel. Thank you so much to Tommy, Brooks, and Lester for these very thought-provoking and illuminating papers. Thank you all for your incredible engagement in the chat.
Thank you for your comment.
Onward.
Your feedback was dope. Was super, super dope. Unlike, she asked us to give her papers like yesterday. Like, most of us gave her our stuff, not all of us, but like, I gave her my paper yesterday. Super dope. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wasn't going to read them until today anyway, so why put that pressure on you? But the last thing that I do want to say is brick by brick, wall by wall, we will free Mumia Abu-Jamal. There is a lot of struggle going on around his situation. Mumia has contracted COVID-19. He currently has congestive heart disease, and there are a lot of actions taking place to get him free as soon as possible. So be on the lookout, free Mumia, free all political prisoners, and enjoy the rest of the conference. On the move.